waste. Well, we already had a whole conversation, but let's like also, I want to
So nice to meet you.
Yes. Lovely to meet you.
Yes.
But I want to dive into your story. And so I want to talk about kind of like, well, let's first just start off with your background, like where you're from, and then maybe how you got to where you are today.
Yes. Oh, a loaded question to kind of
Start off.
Where do I?
I mean, we got
where do
pretty
I
deep
start
already.
From? Yeah, I know exactly, and it does. I mean, where I'm from contributes to the spiritual abuse conversation for sure. I grew up in Alabama, and I grew up in a family where there's the conservative people or the like fundamentalist people, and then there's the people who think the fundamentalist people are liberal, and that was what I grew up in. So, and I can safely name it as a cult by definition of what I grew up in. And there's that layer of it, which is like very nightmarish.
Yeah.
And then there's the other layer. I have 6 siblings. We were very close.
You were or weren't?
We were, yeah.
Oh, were.
Yeah, growing up. And and a lot of it's like trauma bonding because we were the only people that, you know, had this similar experience. We were all pretty close in age.
What is trauma bonding, by
Trauma
the way?
bonding, yeah, that's a really good question. It's what happens when you go through a trauma it can happen with people that you go through the trauma with those people, and so you guys experience the trauma together, and so the trauma itself bonds you, but it might color the relationship a little bit. There tends to be some codependency that can happen in that. Definitely have experienced that with sibling relationships and parental relationships. You can develop a trauma bond with your abuser, in which you, and part of the reason for that is because when you're abused, there's a huge violation that happens to your soul and like to yourself, and so they've invaded you without your permission, but they're still there,
Right.
and so you're bonded to them because they've gotten into you, but they're not necessarily there by invitation.
Right, but it's an emotional attachment.
Yeah, which is why women keep going back to their abuser,
Right.
you know, abusive marriages, and they can't leave. And that totally happened with me. I was 26 when I left my family of origin, moved out of my family of origin, and
What happened at 26?
Well, how many layers
This is where
are
we
going
bust
into?
out the gin now. Yeah.
So grew up in a cult, was close with my siblings. We used like humor and, you know, fun to kind of deflect, and so there was a lot that was happening at the same time as this nightmare thing happened. Wasn't allowed to go to college, was sort of raised to, like, you're a woman, you're supposed to be wife and mom.
I see.
Which is kind of where my book comes into play, because there's a very feminist twist to that. And so, like, you don't need a college degree. All you're going to do is just like be home and take care of your kids, and so you don't need a college degree. And so I ended up doing college in secret, like 2 years of school, just completely in secret, before my family knew about it. And at some point, I realized the only way to escape was to be financially independent. And so I just came up with a plan for getting my college degree. I was working as a nanny. I had been kicked out of my house, or kicked out of my parents' house. And
Is it because they found out you were going to school?
because I took a job without.
Well, how dare you?
Yeah, took a job, and it wasn't so much that I took the job; it was that I didn't ask my dad's permission. And at that point, I was almost 25 years old.
I see.
And I just kind of flipped in my brain of like, I'm almost 25. I should not have to ask my dad for permission. But at that point, he owned everything. He owned the cars, the place that I lived. Like, I had no money, I had no resources, and so, like, what did I have to like fight back with? Like nothing. But I just made this decision. I was like, I shouldn't have to ask my dad for permission to take a job.
So, what's your dad's expectation prior to all this? Like, is like in the time when you would be going to college, what is he kind of expecting you to actually be doing during
Serve
the time?
the family. Yeah.
Like, what does that mean?
That, like, make your father's vision come true, and then you get married and you make your husband's vision come true. And so probably the most practical way that played out is he has a massive home. It's a mansion, but we built it. Like, the kids built it. Like, we
By hand?
Yeah, like
you built a
I
house?
worked and built a house, like, for my dad. And so I call that slave labor now because of how much time we put into it. And then I always like justified it as like, well, you know, if I were an adult living somewhere, like, I would be paying rent. So this is like my rent. That's what I called it. But it wasn't until I was like 24, 25 that I was like, oh, but if I were paying rent somewhere, I would have autonomy and I would be able to go anywhere I wanted to and I'd make decisions, and I could take a job, and I could read whatever books I wanted to, and I could watch whatever movies I wanted to. I could leave whenever, you know, like, if I were paying rent. And so it just stopped computing for me, because I'm like, because it was slave labor. It was total slave labor happening inside the home, and all justified by God. Like, you know, he is the voice of God in our lives, and he is the authority. And our job, you know, as long as we are serving him and doing what he wants, then everything's fine. We're doing what God wants us to do. And so he was like that umbrella of just like anything, as long as we're making him happy, which is like, it's genius. Like, it's genius. I was like, this is like Hitler genius. If you can get all the people under you to fear God in order to obey you, it's not you. It's like, oh, me, the dad, I'm not saying this. God's saying
it's a master manipulator.
I'm just trying to do what God wants me to do. Like, this isn't my idea. This is God's idea. And so.
And then how could you refute that?
You couldn't. I mean, eventually you can but it takes a long time, because like, it took me forever to realize. One of the reasons why I went to seminary was I was like, I know what he taught me was wrong, but he was the person who taught me how to read the Bible. He was the person who taught me how to interpret the Bible. Every story that I knew about the Bible had his words infused into it. And I just was like, I need to go and just get tools so I can like combat this in my own head and know how he twisted this and understand how he twisted it, and then know what it's actually supposed to say. So that was the onus for doing that, because he infected everything. And he still does, you know, it's going to take.
You're still in a relationship with your father?
No, his voice though, his voice is still impacting the way that I experience things sometimes. So I anticipate. I was like, I left when I was 26. And so I'll probably be, you know, in therapy working through this the same amount of time that I lived there. So at 52, I should be better. That's what I'm gonna be good.
You know, did you have brothers as well? Okay, what's the role of a boy versus a daughter in the household?
Yeah, there was a difference and I'm seeing more now that we're all adults now, and just the different impact that it had on the women versus the men. And my younger brother shared with me that he was confused because he grew up and there were like the man's role and the woman's role, and like little things like my dad never cleared his place after dinner. Like, he would show up, eat dinner, then get up and leave, and someone else would do it. And it was like that, like the man, he's not supposed to like touch the dishes, like that kind of mentality. But then my brother, who was a boy, he had to do dishes. And so he was like, so men don't do dishes, but then I have to do dishes. And so like that confusion of like, there's this rule for like my dad as a man, he doesn't have to do these things, but Caleb as a boy, he did. And so like you're kind of told confusing, conflicting messages, and he did. Like, and I would say if anything characterized childhood, it was confusion, constant confusion, constant speaking out of both sides of your mouth and receiving two messages at once. And so there's definitely a difference in the way the men are raised and the women are raised. It's still damaging for both. But the men at least had a way out. At some point, they were going to be in power because they were going to have a family. And they were going to be married.
And then repeat the same cycle.
Yes. Yes. And so my yeah, and so that was just kind of their way out, and so there was just a different approach to life. But my dad still considered himself still an authority until they were married. And I remember him telling me, like, I can't see anything in the Bible that says that someone is not under their parents' authority. But when they're married, obviously the husband has to be an authority, so he can't be an authority over someone else. So then that makes sense that they wouldn't have to be an authority any longer. And so it's kind of like, still for men, it was like, you have to get married to not be under the authority of your parents. Very patriarchal, very
super,
very Old Testament for sure.
This is like the highest like contextualization of patriarchy.
Oh yeah, exactly, the highest level for sure.
Where's your mom in all of this?
Yeah, that's a very complex, for sure, very complex, and it's still in process. She's still with him, still defends him, doesn't think he's abusive. Yeah, there was a definitely scale falling off my eyes moment several years ago where I realized, oh, she's not just a victim in this. She's also an abuser. And so I had to, when you have two parents, this is common in like abusive families, you have two parents, one is abusive, more abusive than the other, you kind of emotionally attached to the one that's less abusive, and
still abusive
because
nonetheless.
You just need a parent to be good, you know. And I recognize that. I was like, I need my parent. I need one parent, you know, one stable parent, one healthy parent. And I do have genuine experiences with my mom where she was genuinely gave me good advice, where she was genuinely empathetic, where I do believe that she really loved me and really cared about me, and so I have those memories, and those memories are still very real. They're not negated, I don't think, but just that reality of like, I was a child, I didn't have a choice. She was an adult, she didn't.
Right.
She could have done something, and she didn't. So
I guess I am curious to know, like, specifically, like, what happened in your family that you realized this is a cult, this is an abusive system, my household, and then your move to going into seminary, like how you even decided this seminary, this is like how I'm addressing this.
Yeah, I wasn't able to name it as a cult until like this year, so I wasn't able to put it in that category, and I wasn't able to call it abuse until I was in seminary going to therapy for the first time. I was even uncomfortable using that word. And now I'm just looking at it, I was like, what? Of course it was. Yes, it was, but you're just in it, and you grew up in it as a child, and it's normal, and you just don't know anything different. Right. There are definitely like little moments, like aha, like moments, like something's off, something's weird, something doesn't make sense, but it's your family, and like, what you're gonna lose is
unpack that when you say it, but it's your family.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, and like naming like my relationship with my siblings and how close I was with them, and their narrative at the time was, we're one big happy family, and we were like we are like a lot of fun. We're the life of the party. Like we bring the heat. Like we're just like we're a lot of fun, and you want to maintain that. You know, you like, I want to be a part of this thing where we're the fun family, and we tear up the dance floor at weddings, and like I want that narrative to be true.
That's your family identity.
Yeah. And I didn't know that these are the things that I'm gonna be losing. For a while, and I just didn't, it was slow, and it was, progression. And I remember one of my friends, who probably wasn't even able to name it as abuse either, but I remember being at her house, and I was maybe sharing some things about what was happening in my family, and she just said, hey, come with me real quick. And so she like took me through her kitchen into her back room where there was like another bed, and she was like, this bed is for you whenever you need it. And so even though she didn't say, hey, there's something messed up with your family, you need to get out, you need to leave, it was just like, oh, somebody is saying that this is not right, and somebody let me know that they were concerned. And then at the time when I got kicked out of my house, the job that I took was a job at a church. And I was working at this church, and when I got kicked out of my house, I went to work, and one of the pastors came in to my office and shut the door, and I was like, what's happening? And he comes in, and he looks at me, and he says, the average abused woman leaves 12 times before she leaves for good. And then he turned around and he walked out. Whoa. And so to just have someone name it as abuse. And then also that tapped into my competitive spirit, because I was like, I knew I was gonna go back.
I would leave faster than
Yeah,
that.
I know, exactly. I knew I was gonna go back, but I was like, the next time I leave, because I didn't have resources. Like, I didn't have money. I didn't even own a car. I was 20, almost 25. I didn't even own a car. Didn't have a college degree.
Yeah.
Like, I was like, I need things in place before I can leave.
Yeah.
But the next time I leave, I'm leaving for good.
Yeah.
And so once I owned a car, and I borrowed the money from my dad and then paid it off, and once I had a car, I was like, okay, even if I have to sleep in my car, I'm not going back. I will not go back. And I even at one point was sleeping in a garage with roaches in it, because it was just like, but even that was better than living in that home. Like, just the ability to breathe, like make decisions, watch R-rated movies and not have to worry about it.
You know, when you were talking about your family, like a pit fell into my stomach.
Yeah.
Wow. That's crazy.
It is.
Yeah.
I will accept that word.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I'm not hopefully in an offensive way, but it's just like I can't believe like. It saddens me.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like that's not that long ago.
It really isn't. Yeah, I'm going on 10 years now of not living in my hometown.
Yeah.
Which is not that long ago.
Right.
So it really, less than a decade.
Just like that
since
these
I left.
systems or like people exist, and you think like this day and age, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it was actually in order, like me being able to name it as a cult. I watched The Vow on HBO, about the Nexium story, and that is a cult that didn't happen in the desert. It didn't happen in a bunker.
Right.
It happened in a neighborhood near you,
yeah.
and with professional people who were associated with it. And that was really helpful for me to be like, okay, just because we were in a normal neighborhood with normal friends and normal lives.
Normal.
All this stuff that was happening underneath that nobody knew about.
Right.
Or some people suspected, but not enough. And because we were maintaining this one big happy family image, which I contributed to, they didn't have a reason. Like, well, at least they're happy. Okay, Catherine's not allowed to go to college, but she's happy. You know, she's fun. She's having a good time. So there was no need to address or get more involved. And again, I couldn't name it as abuse at the time. And so I had been drawn to ministry and wanted to go into, I didn't think women were allowed to be pastors, so, but do something pastoral. And so I ended up going to Mexico and worked there and helped plant a church, and then ended up in seminary. And I worked in youth ministry while I was in seminary, and that was also where I first started going to therapy. And it's so weird because I remember going to therapy and I was like, I know that there was something messed up about my family, but I don't have any evidence in myself. I was like, I have friends, I can keep a job, I can go to school, there's no evidence, I don't see how this impacted me. Yet, I had this awareness that there was no way that it could not have impacted me. It had to have impacted me somehow. So I should probably go to therapy.
Right. Because something felt wrong. It's more of a feeling.
I think the only thing that I could say this is off was like dating relationships. Like men and dating was just, I'd never had a boyfriend. I'd never really gone on any dates. And at the time, I wasn't aware that men made me uncomfortable in general, but I knew something was off, was just like male relationships or friendships or bosses.
That dynamic.
Yeah, and I remember like my very first therapy session saying, if anything's off, like this is one thing that maybe isn't quite right. Thinking, oh, we're gonna have a few sessions and we're gonna be fine.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
20 years
going
later,
on going on like 8 years off and on of therapy. I'm like still in therapy and I love therapy. I love it. I love therapy.
That's kind of where I guess things get a little bit murky for me in situations like this, because I understand that, like, and maybe this is being naive or like giving people an excuse, I guess, but because even if you're an adult and you do have choices and you have a level of awareness, but you may not have a full level of awareness. So maybe I'm not trying to go against anything you're saying, but in general situations like this, it's like, could we ever think like, well, they're just not aware yet, and then give them permission, or is that like compounding the abuse even more? That's
a really good question, and like at what point? And just taking the church situation that we both experienced into consideration of, I mean, I had to have that awakening. And I even realized how much, because I was associated with the denomination for several years, and I am realizing now within the past few years that I went to this patriarchal, misogynistic denomination because it was familiar.
Right.
And that was its own trauma bond.
Yeah.
Of like, and I had someone say that to me one time. I was one of my roommates. Yeah. So I can safely say that now that it's patriarchal. But at the same time, I still have friends in there, and I have friends who are elders in this. Yeah. I have friends who are pastors in this denomination. And so,
and probably don't feel that way.
No, no, and even women who like, oh, I'm cared for. Yeah. People listen to me as a woman. I'm valued, and like they'll say those things. And so, I can't say.
No, you're not.
You're not. Yeah, like, and you're a liar. You should get out of this. Like, I mean, people have had their own journey. Yeah. And I know folks who are attempting with this denomination to fight cases of abuse within the denomination using the denominational system. Right. I think it's a total waste of time. It's not going to work. The entire system is toxic. Yeah. And so, for them to try to fight abuse. Using a toxic system to fight abuse, it's not going to work, and I've seen it happen. Domino effect, over and over and over again in different sections of this denomination, different regions happening. The same thing happening because the whole system toxic. But folks have to go through that themselves. Like they just do. Like you have to go through it yourself.
So therapy for 8 years.
Off and on. For about 8 years now, and I've just. The classic experience of therapy, the first 6 months were just hell, because it was just like that, a metaphor of digging a poison bullet out of a wound, and that was happening for about 6 months. It was just, and I remember
what came to the surface.
So much. I remember leaving one. I actually, because of my challenges that I had with men, I ended up getting a therapist who was a man, and to just like be in that context.
You are competitive.
Man.
You're like, I did not have problems with men. I'm going to get a male therapist.
Might be an issue. But I remember one session leaving, and my hand was like clenched so tight, and like I got home and I like opened it up, and I just had like little like mini, half moon bloody fingers imprints into my hand, just because it was like there was just so much coming up, like just 26 years in a cult. So
that's where it was really like you're actualizing the fact of what happened.
And just like, and I didn't know anything about trauma. I didn't know anything about, again, I couldn't even name it as abuse. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't name it as abuse. And so, it took, pretty intense therapy has taken. And then now that I'm working with survivors of abuse, I I'm learning a lot.
Right.
You know, I'm learning a lot about my own family, and not informed a lot of, because I'd been in therapy maybe like 3 or 4 years when I ended up at the church in California, and I had that to help inform me about what was going on at the church in California. And I remember a couple people remarking, Katherine, you figured this out like a lot faster than most people did. And I was like, yeah, because I was having the same feelings of what I was experiencing with my family. And at first I gaslit myself and was like, oh, I'm being triggered, but nothing's wrong.
Right.
And so it's my problem. It's my trauma. I need to address my issues.
Yeah.
And then it took me a little while to be like, oh no, it's not me. I'm triggered because the same thing is happening.
Right.
Like,
it's familiar.
This is really wrong. This is really, really messed up. So I had that experience to draw from in navigating that abuse situation.
So I really actually wanted to interview for a while, and it took me a while to actually reach out to you and ask you. I was nervous asking.
Really?
Yeah.
What made you nervous?
Well, because we really didn't know each other. Like, we were like barely acquaintances before, and then it was just like I get nervous asking anyone to be on my podcast.
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean, I want to say this, not that like this is how everyone should be, but like I was so impressed and amazed by like knowing like because we worked at the same church in LA, and knowing that you left, and I knew knowing the circumstances there, like why you left, but not necessarily particularly your story, but then that you then established nonprofit, Tears of Eden. You started this podcast called Uncertain, which was like talking to spiritual abuse survivors. And like, even for me, I was like, I wish I had that, because to hear the stories and hear the words, it's not until you hear it that then you're like, that was me, or like I get it, and so I just to see you like make so much good out of it. I was just like blown away. And then you wrote a book. I was like, who is this woman? Like, she got a podcast, she got a website, she got a nonprofit.
And never sleeps. That's who she is.
But it's wonderful though, because I mean, you've literally out of, obviously this is very like deep in you and a part of you, but that you've created something really beautiful, and like Tears of Eden, I know is what you want it to be, resources for other people, And the podcast is great because it puts the stories out there, and you can hear the words, hear the emotions, and like literally again, like for me like us having attended the same church with that experience and that system, it's because again, it's so confusing, and it's like hard to name. It's hard to even articulate to someone for them to even say, "Oh, this is what this is." It wasn't like for this like obscure book that happened to be recommended to me to read, that I happened to end up reading, that someone recommended.
Right.
And I was like,
oh,
this is it.
We went through the same thing. We were at the same place.
Yeah.
Whoa.
So I do want to ask you about your experience at that church, because you said. I don't know where I read this, but you said like, I think it was your interview with Diane Langberg, and you said you knew it was time to leave. Like, I did everything I could, and it was time to go. And that's something I struggled with a lot before I left, because I was like, have I done enough? And my friend kept on asking me, what is mine? Like, ask yourself, what is mine to do? And I was like, I'm not sure. Like, I feel like I need to do more. This is my church. Like, I need to stick by my church or whatever.
Right.
How did you know it was time to go for you?
Right. Yeah. Before I answer that, I want to say, like, when you said, I wish I would have had this when I was leaving, like, that was so meaningful to me, because like creating Tears of Eden and creating the podcast, I'm making the resource that I wish I would have had.
Yes.
Like, that is exactly what I wanted it to be. So that means so much to me. Hearing your feedback on that, that's really helpful. And then just like coming to that moment of like, I need to leave. Was that the question?
Yeah. Like, how did you know?
Straw. And I'm curious, like, I want to talk to you about this too, because that idea of like I need to make sure that I've done everything I can.
Yeah.
I've only ever heard women say that. And I said the same thing, like I need to know that I've exhausted every resource system and tried everything. And I'm curious if men have that same experience. You know, I've talked to a few men who've been through these things.
Oh, really?
And I think that that's a cultural, like, I need to be tough. I don't want to admit that I was a victim.
Actively pretend, or just like, I can't engage with this emotion?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, both. In general, that's been my experience with most men. Or they'll say it was a hurtful experience, but to name it as abuse, that tends to be a little more challenging for men. But I haven't ever heard a man yet, and I'm not saying that they haven't said this, I haven't yet heard a man say, I needed to do everything I could before I left. Like, I haven't heard that. That may be their experience, but I tend to hear women say that, and even women that I know now in these abusive situations saying, I need to make sure that I've done everything I can before I can leave. And so I'm wondering how much gender impacts that. And I mean, I said the same thing. I need to know. And I would say there was a lot of final moments, straw that broke the camel's back, last, okay, I'm done. Like, I've got to leave. And I remember one Sunday, kind of like your Twilight experience of like, this is really rotten, and then everyone's smiling. Like, I had a moment similar to that where I was it was one of the big festival party things. I can't remember which one it was, but I was there. I was the youth director. I show up, do my thing, get pizza for the youth, yada yada yada. And a woman came up to me, and she had kids in children's ministry, and I think one of her kids was like in 5th grade, so they were gonna like be in the youth ministry soon. And so and that was kind of how she started the conversation was, oh, you're gonna be my kid's youth leader soon. And so she starts talking to me, and then she says, okay, so I've been wanting to talk to you and just like see how you're doing with everything in the church. My husband and I, we know what's going on. We have written letters, and we've been talking. We're aware of what's happening. I just want you to know, how are you doing? How can we help? And she's saying this, and as she's talking to me, I'm suddenly just getting like super nervous. And I'm looking around, and I'm like, executive director's over there. My boss is over there, and elders there, and they see me talking to her, and they're not like looking at me, but I'm like, they're aware that I'm having this conversation with this woman, and obviously if her husband's written letters and they've been talking to people and they're friends with people who've left, like they know who this woman is, they see me talking to her, and like basically I'm in danger because I'm having a conversation. Because
you're associated with this person who's against the church.
Against the church. But I was also like, and then she's a parent. And so I'm the youth director. Like, she's within my, ministry realm of people that I should be talking to on a Sunday. And I can't even have a conversation with her without fear. I was like, okay, we're done. Like, we're done. Like, I was like, I just remember that like super clearly.
Because you're like, this isn't how it should be?
I couldn't do my job without fear. Like, that's what it was. Like, I can't even do my job without being afraid of like, what can I say? What, and like having to have this conversation with this woman and be honest with her, like, this is a situation, but also be like, I have to be super diplomatic because I could lose my job. I'm just like, what if, like, what will they do? How will they respond to this? How will they retaliate? How are they going to get back at me? And what are they going to take away? What, like, how is this going to present because I'm associated? And like that, and like, there was a lot of like people that I wouldn't post on Instagram with that I was with them, like that kind of thing was happening. But it wasn't until that moment when like, this is someone, part of my job, and I can't do my job without fear. Like that was like, okay, we're done. We're done. And I left, and I didn't have a job when I left. Like, I resigned not having a job. I got super lucky that I got one really fast.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was just like, I have to go. I don't know what.
Can you define spiritual abuse or and a toxic system? Because I think because I learned this through your podcast that spiritual abuse is actually a newer understanding, which I didn't know. I actually thought that was like been around for a while, but like maybe for people who are not
itself is
right. Let's be very clear. It's been around for a long time, but not understood like in the specifics.
There's more awareness of it for sure. Very, very recently, like in the past few years. Yeah.
So what is spiritual abuse and what makes a system toxic?
Yeah. It's hard to define spiritual abuse just like as a definition, and there are a lot of people who use different definitions. The definition that we use with Tears of Eden is a deliberate use of God in the Bible to cause shame and harm, leading to a breakdown in relationship between God, self, and others. And we have that results in there of like leading to that breakdown between relationship with yourself, relationship with God, relationship with others.
Ooh, Freudian slip.
Yes, and elders. That was perfect.
Do we capture that?
Elders, you are God. So having that, like what it leads to, because a lot of times, and you had mentioned this earlier, you recognize the symptoms and the signs and the feeling before you recognize what happened and what people did. And examples of like spiritual abuse where it's like kind of mixed up in there. And I mentioned before we started recording that I had an abusive boss at this church. And I remember just like sitting in like these conflict resolution, conversations. And it was like, we're resolving conflict, and you have issues and you have issues, and let's try and figure out our issues together. And they're approaching it like, Christians shouldn't have conflict, and we should, resolve our conflict. But there was no category for abuse. Right. And they also weren't taking into account that this was there's a power dynamic. Like, it's my boss. Yeah. So it's not just conflict when he's injuring me.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to do like peacemakers and like, all these things to try and like resolve, fracturing between brothers, whatever. Like,
can you explain why that power dynamic is important and why it's a conflict of interest and as you're trying to resolve
conflict? Yeah, especially when the offending party is someone in power, because the person not in power doesn't have the same agency and doesn't have the same voice in that situation.
Like influence?
Just power in general. And so so if it were like you and me and we were peers and, you yelled at me or were like used your body to intimidate me or blocked me in a room or berated me for, 2 hours, like if you did that, I would be like, screw you. We're not friends. I'm blocking you and everything. Right. Like, we're not, and it wouldn't have the same trauma impact potentially, and maybe wouldn't even fall into abuse category because there's not a power dynamic. But when that comes from someone in power and like, I can't leave, I can't extricate myself, I can't tell you to shut up because you're my boss.
Right, and also they have power to influence your job and your security, I guess, in terms of getting money.
Yeah, and power can work in, if there's any power dynamic, like you have a loan with them, you have spiritual power, they're your pastor, like that power dynamic can come in so many different ways, which is where the spiritual abuse comes in. Is it's like, if someone says, if you're, crying because you had you lost a loved one and someone comes up to you and they're a peer and they say, well, praise God in all circumstances, that might be considered like spiritual abuse. But if a pastor, your spiritual authority, like shames you for grieving, and tells you in the name of God, you should be praising God in all circumstances, you shouldn't be crying, like that would be spiritual abuse, because it's like they're in a position of power, they're using God and the authority of God to shame you for a human emotion.
Right.
And so that would just be an example.
Yeah.
Where
does the power of a pastor come from?
Like, who gives it to them?
Yeah. Maybe like who gives it to them, or like where does the authority come from, I guess?
Well, I think why it can be damaging, and why if they misuse God's name and misuse the power of the pulpit or misuse the Bible, the reason why it can be damaging is because they are in a position of like speaking for God.
Right.
And they are speaking authoritatively, using the word of God.
Right. It's almost like, I imagine, like a doctor-patient relationship. It's like they have, I don't know if this is right, but like assumed authority because they have knowledge about your body, and so you're kind of depending on them in that way.
Knowledge is power for sure. Yeah. And it's an intimate, and I think that's why spiritual abuse can be so damaging, because it's an intimate sort of relationship.
Which might be different in a corporate office where it's like your CEO and an employee per se. I mean, like abuse certainly still happens. Yeah, but your soul, right?
Yeah, it's your soul, and they and you've placed, you know, because if I'm in a corporate setting, my boss is an asshole. Oh, whatever.
Yeah.
Bosses are assholes. My boss isn't an asshole.
Make that very clear.
Like, yes.
I like my job.
But it's so different when they are in a pastoral role, and they're teaching the Bible, and they're caring for your soul, and caring for you as a person. A lot of times pastors have access to information about you, and I think of like meetings that I had like with my abusive boss and other people, and we would pray and during meeting, like before meeting. Okay, that seems like such a simple thing in church. Oh yeah, everybody prays. But prayer is very intimate, and we're gathering together and we're calling on God together to like bless whatever it is we're doing. And you're an abuser in it, and you're the one talking to God and asking God to bless what we're doing, but then you are an abuser. Like, that is so disrupting, so disequilibrating, and so just like, is God gonna listen? Is God gonna do anything? Is it
like, what's the word you use? It's like disorienting?
Disorienting, disrupting.
Is it because like in your mind, we're seeing God as a good and like safe figure, and then there's an abusive figure kind of like intermingling like in that?
Yeah. I mean, it's as simple as like, how dare you talk to God when you're like doing these kinds of things? Like, how dare you like call on God? And it's like, it's gaslighting in itself of just to like have a horrible person beseeching the heavens as if nothing is going on and as if nothing is wrong. And then it's also just this experience of like, well, then what's wrong with me that I'm now having a hard time praying and like being here, and I can't approach God with these people in this approach God. That's just a very Christianese way of expressing it. Or that I'm feeling disrupted even in this moment of like, when we're supposed to be, caring about kids and mentoring them and teaching them and caring for their souls, and another Christianese phrase, but just like caring for them as a person, and then this is happening, and then you're getting up there and you're teaching from the Bible, and then
like as a representative almost.
Representing God in that particular setting, and whether we shouldn't be giving them that place. And a lot of people will gaslight you and say, well,
we're all sinners.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, we shouldn't put
Yeah.
pastors on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, they're on a pedestal. Like,
Yeah.
you know, we have a stage and there's a pulpit and they're
Right.
standing up there and they're holding the Bible just by virtue of that position.
The
like
physical like elevation of them. Yeah.
Yeah, like they are on a pedestal.
Right.
Like whether we put them there or not, like they're there.
Right.
And they're now misusing God's word from that place
Right.
of authority and
Right.
power.
What? How does a pastor or someone like that misuse authority to, like, what are they for what end?
I have many theories. I think it can be spiritually abusive, but not necessarily have spiritually abused people and not necessarily be an abuser. And I can think of ways that.
Can you clarify that?
Yeah, and I can think of like a very specific thing. There was this horrible book that I was given and devoured
what
when I
book?
lived with my parents. It's called Created to be His Helpmeet.
Okay,
It's basically a book about how to manipulate your husband by being perfect. It's basically
God.
the essential, it's an awful, awful book. And I was involved with Crew on campus, and I was leading the women's Bible study, and I gave every woman in that group the book. And I'm like, a horribly spiritually abusive book. And I gave it to people, and I like, you know, like, this is a great book. Like, and
What does that make you feel now, knowing that now? I
yeah,
guess?
I told, I actually have become reacquainted with a woman who was like in that study, and I said to her, like, I wish I like knew all the names of everyone in that group, because I would like go back and be like, I don't believe this anymore.
Yeah.
It's a terrible book. If you still have it, you should burn it, because I burned it. And I told her that, and she was very kind, and she was just like you shouldn't get distracted with, am I abuser or am I not? She was like, you're not. Like, you were in these, you were brainwashed basically, and you perpetuated it, but you were brainwashed. And so, like, basically, don't misplace the guilt of, you know, what you did in these circumstances when you kind of didn't have a choice a little bit. And while I don't fully agree with it, and I still think, it could have caused a lot of damage. Yeah. Hopefully, these women were like, this book is crazy,
right.
And got rid of it. But damage could have been caused, but my ends. And that makes spiritual abuse tricky, because some people can be spiritually abusive and their intention is good, and like they really do have like honorable intentions, right. And they've been told this is what God wants from you, and I would say, and I wouldn't put this in the spiritual abuse category, but just how many people have been anxious on my behalf of my soul? Am I a Christian still? Or am I, because I don't go to church right now, and I'm very actively addressing abuse in churches, and, you know, saying things, well, don't give up on God, and like, you know, stuff like worried that I've like, you know, walked away from the faith, or, you know, whatever. And I wouldn't put that in the spiritual abuse category, but it could get there if they were like shaming me.
Right.
Does
this tie back to like what you were saying about how, what your friend was saying, how like you were brainwashed and you didn't know any better? Like does that kind of also correlate with your mom a little bit too? Like could it be in the sense that like she was brainwashed?
Oh, she's totally brainwashed.
And like she hasn't been enlightened or come to an awareness maybe?
Yeah.
Like could we, and it's like a genuine question, which is like, could we offer her a similar type of like,
oh yeah,
I hate to use this word.
Grace.
Grace.
Yeah, and I think that if she were to recognize that something was wrong and were to leave my dad and get help, my response to her would be very different than if my dad realized something was wrong and like repented, you know, because like the level of damage that my father caused and I have arrived at this place, and this may change, so I'm saying this, but then I could change this. Like, the level of damage that he's caused, even if today he were to have an about face and realize I messed up, he is so screwed up. Like, he as a human being, he's very twisted and very unhealthy. And if he were to get into therapy and start doing the work now, it would be so many years before he would be someone safe for me to engage with. So I don't see a category in which I would ever be in a relationship with him again, even if he were to come to a place where he understood. It's very different from my mom. It just is. Because she is totally brainwashed.
For when people are going to listen or watch this, I would love to, help them get a better understanding of it, and also help them maybe identify, is my community, am I in a spiritual abusive community? Like, how do I know? So I kind of want to like go in that direction. Like, what is it? What did it look like?
Something we say at Tears of Eden a lot is trust your gut. And in these communities, and this is part of like the toxicity, like you're kind of taught that your flesh is bad, your body's bad, your emotions are bad. And so I think that would be the first thing of just like, if you've got a little yellow, and I've worked in 5 different churches, and I learned after like the 3rd church, anything that is like kind of a yellow flag when you're like interviewing, that's gonna be a major issue once you get there.
That's a good
And so just like, pay attention and don't suppress it. You might not, because it's so subtle and it eventually happens over time, you might not be able to say how bad it is because it's usually little things. So like paying attention to those things, asking those questions, take notes, because if you're dealing with a narcissist, like it's a total mind. So like write it down so that you can like go back. And I think like now I took so many notes and I saved emails. And so when I go back and I read it now, I'm like, like how did I not see how bad this was? Like what we're talking about is like an experience of spiritual abuse, and this chronic experience of spiritual abuse. It's hard. It's difficult to say, this is what happened. Like, beginning, middle, end, and like this is an example of spiritual abuse because it is so experiential. And I'm working on writing a book about spiritual abuse right now, and what I'm trying to do is write on one level what happened, and then on another level just an embodied experience of what's happening inside of me as this is happening. Because so often when you try to tell someone this is what happened, like they look at you like you're crazy, or like you have 3 heads, or and it's like they just,
or that's it, like that's what
that's
happened.
All? That's all that happened?
Doesn't seem so bad.
And part of that is because of the toxic culture, like this has been normalized to look like Christianity. There's some of the stuff is just like our views of forgiveness and reconciliation and gossip, and how that's weaponized. Like don't gossip is weaponized. And that was actually helpful for my family of origin. Of like, I remember like my dad using "don't gossip" as a way to like suppress us and silence us. I was like, if something bad is happening, like I'm gonna talk about it. Like sorry, like I'm just gonna something I posted on Instagram that just got so much interaction that I was really shocked that it did. But it's very simple. But it was like, exposing abuse is not gossip, and that is what it's used for, is to silence people from talking about abuse. Don't gossip, don't tear down the church, don't, protect the pastors, whatever. And to expose abuse and to say this is happening here and this is wrong. And I'm gonna keep talking about it until you do something about it.
Part of the reason why it also, I think, extends that far out is because it's a system. Because if the system was healthy, it can like take care of the one person that's like doing that. But once you have an unhealthy leader and a toxic system, that's what kind of almost, I could be wrong, but I feel like that's what like perpetuates this beyond measure.
And I would say I have not yet encountered an abuser in a position of authority that didn't have a toxic system. It's like they exist
hand in hand.
together. An abuser doesn't get into power without help, either by enablers or people who just look the other way,
Yeah.
or what's called flying monkeys, people who do their bidding for them and work on their behalf. Whether the narcissist, chicken before egg, I don't know whether the narcissist created the system or the system created the narcissist. I don't know.
Yeah.
But they exist together, typically. And I would just say, like my own family, how we contributed to that system. And still, many family members still contribute to that system of immediate family and extended family, of just propping up my dad by not calling him out. So just by turning a blind eye and pretending it's not happening. Like that. Inaction is action, basically, a situation. And sometimes it's just, you know, you freeze because of trauma. And that's real. That happens too. So if we're going to extend grace, let's extend it there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
To people who just are so confused and they don't know what to do. And you do freeze. And that's real and that's legitimate too.
Yeah. So if you're at a church now, how might one identify or recognize that they might be in an abusive system or a toxic system with an abusive leader?
I mean, I would go back to that trusting your gut and paying attention to the yellow flags thing. And you can be patient with yourself. Like, you might not know, you know, and you might have to watch for the patterns for a few years before you know. And nobody knows. Like, nobody joins a church thinking, oh, I'm going to join a spiritually abusive church. Like, they're joining a good family. They like it. They like the music. They like the pastor. Whatever reason you joined a church, you're joining a good thing. You want to be a part of a good thing. And so the fact that you don't see it right away, or it takes a few years, or it takes, you know, going through these cycles a few times, that's okay. Like, that's normal. And it is subtle in general. Spiritual abuse is very subtle. It's gonna take a minute to see, and then there's a lot of people, and then one of the reasons why, like, I'm not involved in a church right now, is I just don't have the energy to go through the cycle. You know, I don't have the energy to be in a place and wait for it to rear its head. I don't want to go through that right now.
I mean, with everything that you've been through, and even now with this podcast where I think you're almost 50 plus episodes of stories and experts, and being really entrenched in this world and topic, is it important for us to, like, save the church, or, like, why is this so important?
Well, something that I have to be cognizant of is, like, someone who leaves the institution isn't leaving the church. They're still a part of the church. And so it makes me laugh when people accuse me of tearing down the church. They're like, I'm literally caring for the church. Like, these survivors.
Well, you literally are the church.
These survivors are still a part of the church. They may not be in the institution.
Do you get that from people?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
I get crazy emails, crazy comments. Wow. Mostly for people I don't know.
Okay,
and it's funny. And I remember my first one. I was like, yes! My first scathing email! I have arrived! People are offended, yes! No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, so, like, people who leave the church, leave the institution. Institution is not church. Like, that's not church. It's something we made. Like, we made this thing called congregation that you go to on Sunday morning. That's not necessarily church, you know. Like, it can be.
Right.
But someone who can't participate in that system isn't necessarily outside the church. They might have decided that they don't identify as a Christian anymore, or decided that's the, but I'm like, you are still part of the church.
That's why I love what Diane Langbert says. She said, we've confused the institution, the system, and the building for the church, but it's the people who, you know, love God that is the church.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. What was the question? I lost the question.
What was the question? Oh, just like why is this important, or like why?
Oh,
like,
why should we save the church?
Yeah, why should we save the church?
Should we save the church? Yeah.
I mean, is that even the right question to ask? You know?
Yeah, save the institution, the church, save the church. You know, I think the church will always exist. I just think it's a force unto itself.
Like
honestly.
the institution?
Not the institution necessarily, but just like if the church is people who identify with the human Jesus, you know, and believe that Jesus is also God, and that is the definition of someone who's a part of the church. Like I think that will always exist.
Right.
The institution itself needs some serious revamping, and I'm getting to a place where I might have to say I think it needs to just go.
So I do want to talk about your book before we wrap up.
We'll end on a positive note.
Yes. What was the inspiration behind this book? And also, it's amazing that you wrote a freaking book.
I needed it. I needed it. I saw a Broadway show last night, and the people that I saw it with, one of them said something about how a lot of times people survive by creating art, and I feel like that's what art has been to me. And on certain podcasts, I interview artists on purpose because I'm like, they're gonna help us navigate this. Like they're gonna show us how to get through this darkness, because we're exposing the darkness on one hand, but then we need to have this like, well, what do we do now? And I believe that artists are gonna help us with that. And art has meant so much to me.
So can we just tell people, like, you're a writer, you're a poet, you're an artist, you're an actor, you're a podcaster, you're a teacher, like, that's
and it all kind of flows together. Yes.
That's what's like awesome about, like, I feel like this period of your life, it's like so many of those things are converging right now, and it's also in a helpful way too.
I hope so. Yes. Yeah. And I would say that just like that ability to, I was just a writer as a kid, and I did theater as a kid, and I really think that was why I never silenced my intuition completely. That's because I had to have that intuition to create. I just needed it. But yeah, so the book itself is, there's a musical called Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, about 7 brothers who basically kidnap wives, and it's super sexist and, you know, misogynistic, whatever. It's a fun story, but made in the 50s. But my sisters and I loved the musical, and we watched it all the time. And one night we were watching it, and I was a teenager, late teens, and my sisters were just like, Katherine, you should write a story, but you should write about sisters getting husbands. And so it, like, that night, like, we like all came up with this idea for this story, and they named the sister that was, I have 4 sisters, and so they like named all of their sisters, and they named the fiancés of the stories, and so I wrote it at that point, and then I rewrote it recently, and it was interesting to read the version that I wrote, which was very misogynistic and very patriarchal.
Really?
And when I wrote it,
wow,
that was me. I thought that was normal. Like, that was my life. That I thought misogyny was men. Like, that's how men are supposed to be. Like,
what did you feel when you saw that?
It was just an observational psychological analysis of like, oh, I remember writing this, and I didn't have a problem with this lifestyle. Like, I thought that this was normal. Like, I didn't have any clue that this was really harmful and damaging. Yeah. And so when I rewrote it, I completely flipped it. Like, it's a patriarchal world with 5 sisters, and the reason why no one wants to marry them is because they're basically feminists and in this patriarchal world. And
quick question, do you ever feel like, sometimes I feel this, which is, you ever feel like I was so entrenched in this one way of thinking, which was like kind of when you look back, right? Like, same as me, I was so entrenched, and I was like gung-ho. I'm sure I've said things that I don't believe in now, and have said things to people that, I really regret. And then now I'm like, this is what I believe. Like, are you ever worried, like, is what I'm thinking now also wrong too? Like,
for
we
sure.
start like not trusting. I mean, that maybe that's a result of the abuse or trauma, but like you start questioning your own self.
Yeah, and I think that's why I call my podcast Uncertain, is because I think one of the damaging messages that I received from the church was that you have to be certain, and you have to have the right answer, and you have to know. And I just wanted to create a space where we can say, maybe we don't know. maybe this is what I think now, and it could change, and we can hold this loosely. We can explore this. We can, you know, and then also just this reality of like, I believe these things, and I wasn't healthy when I was like believing those things. I can say now I'm like, I still have a long way to go, but I would say I'm coming from a healthier place. I'm not coming from a place of shame. I'm not coming from a place of agenda. Like I want everyone to believe, you know, like, and so just having a healthier, and I think we can know that about ourselves if we, and maybe not know that when we're in these spaces, because that's all we knew. And we thought it was, and those things were not mine. Those are things that people forced onto me and coerced me into believing. I embraced them because I didn't have another option. It was survival. And so a lot of times in these systems, people do embrace it because it's survival. Like they don't know that they have another option. And like if to leave the church is to leave God, that's terrifying.
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
To have like, and the people who experience the phobias post leaving church of just like, am I going to hell because I can't do church anymore or whatever. That's a clear indication of brainwashing.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. That's such a good point. So maybe just to wrap things up, what would you tell your younger self?
Wow. I wrote a poem to myself. And in that poem, I was just, basically like giving my younger self their voice. Just like, you do have a voice, and your voice does matter. Because there was just so much silencing happening throughout my whole life. And I would say that's like, you have a voice, and your voice matters.
We will end it there. I feel like there's so much we can. I feel like I'm just
I know.
started.
I feel like it too.
Thank you for listening or watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. To support us, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on your favorite podcasting platform. Thank you.